Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Welcome, friends, to another great episode of the Church Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Jason Day, and I sat down this week with Jim Martin from International Justice Mission. Jim serves as the Vice President of Spiritual Formation at IJM, and he is passionate about equipping pastors and local churches to embrace biblical justice. He is the author of The Just Church, which provides practical strategies to help every church respond tangibly to God's call to seek justice. Now, on this week's episode, Jim and I discuss how justice is tied to disciple making in the local church. Jim speaks into the discussion many churches are having around social justice issues, and he provides a framework that every church can adopt. We also touch on some of the beautiful surprises that churches experience as they step into God's call to seek justice, as well as tangible ideas that you can put into practice in your church and your community. So let's dive right into my conversation with Jim Martin. Jim, welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. So excited that you could join us today, and I'm very excited about the topic that we're going to be diving into. So first of all, just welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, now you have a very, what I think, and I'm sure listeners would think as well, it seems to be a very exciting role in ministry, and that is you serve at International Justice Mission. You're a VP there, and your focus is really on mobilizing churches to really understand and engage in justice issues. And I imagine that must be pretty fascinating. I'm sure you have tons of stories, and we could spend a few days talking through them. But I'm just excited to have you with us because really there are a lot of things going on in our world, and we hear about it. We see it online more and more and more, just because information is so readily available. But justice issues here in our own country, we're recording, talking here in the U.S., but around the world. And we know as pastors, as ministry leaders, we tend to have heavy hearts in regard to a lot of those justice issues.
Yeah.
But you help churches really kind of step a little more deeply into what some of these issues might be. And I think a great place for us to kind of start a conversation, Jim, is a lot of pastors attempt to raise awareness about justice issues. But there's something deeper for us to step into as local congregations. Awareness is important, but there's more there. So can you talk to us a little bit about how all that kind of comes together, how you see that being most effective, kind of the awareness piece, and then what comes next?
Sure. In terms of awareness, I would just say that it is important. I think that sometimes we skip right over that. But the reality is awareness in and of itself doesn't actually do anything, but until awareness has happened, nothing else is going to happen. And so just the idea of church leaders listening to podcasts like this, reading books like The Just Church, which we'll talk about, this is a huge step forward because it makes people aware and sort of sensitizes them to what's actually going on out there in the world. So that is important. Beyond that, however, there's a deep dive to be taken, and I think people are often surprised by how deep the dive can be, even if we just were to talk about the scriptures. So maybe we could say maybe there's two conversations to have. One is about the push factors that Christians experience when they finally see the justice content in the scriptures, and then sort of the pull factors that they experience when they finally see what's actually going on in the world and the kind of suffering that's happening because of injustice in the world.
Yeah, Jim, I think it's powerful because oftentimes, and we run into these conversations, and I know that IJM runs into these as well. Conversations, there tends to be some pushback to some degree in some traditions against social justice, and
Sure.
I've heard things like, just focus on the gospel, don't worry about justice issues, which
Right.
There might be listeners today who are wrestling through that same thing. Can you talk to us a little bit about how justice issues tie into the beauty and the fullness of the gospel?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, maybe what we should say is it might be helpful for us to stop talking about social justice and start talking about biblical justice. And I think there can be appropriate pushback and reactions to the concept of social justice, which is often very wide but not very deep.
Right.
And then, but when we do start to look carefully at the scriptures and we start to read people like, say, Old Testament scholar Christopher J.H. Wright. In his, he was kind enough to write a foreword to the book that I wrote called The Just Church. And in it, he basically said there is no genre of biblical literature that does not deal with the concept of injustice. In fact, the Old Testament speaks to injustice more than it does to any other issue save idolatry. And so the reality is somehow many of us in our training and in our pastoral experience have actually missed this important content of the scriptures. So I would say we need to go back and take a good look at that, and we need to start talking more and more about biblical justice.
Yeah, I love that. I love the biblical justice. I love that terminology because that really helps us stay rooted, not in just what might be happening in the news or what might be kind of almost trendy in a way. Sometimes we bump into those types of things, but it helps us stay rooted in Scripture. And the reality is, as pastors, as ministry leaders, whenever we have people, and oftentimes, honestly, it tends to be, at least here in the U.S., that a lot of the pushback is blurred lines around political ideologies. I mean, if we're just to be honest, so there's some of that pushback. So it allows, I think, us as pastors, as churches, to stay rooted in Scripture, focused on, as you said, biblical justice, and help people see that this isn't, a political issue. This isn't just, a cultural issue, but this is a heart issue for God and his people, right?
Yeah. And if you look at very, very simple things, I mean, we could look at the book of Isaiah. We could look at the beginning of the book of Isaiah, and we could find Isaiah 1:17, where the prophet says to the people of God, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Now, we can do some sort of theological gymnastics and turn that into some kind of abstraction, or we can just read it and say, oh my goodness, God is calling us to reflect this aspect of God's character, this aspect of justice. I mean, he's the God the foundation of whose throne is righteousness and justice, according to Psalm 89, right? So this is an issue of our discipleship. It's how we mirror part of the imaging of God as the church and as individual believers.
Yeah. Let's dive into that a little more in regard to discipleship, because that's really kind of what seems to me to be the major theme that comes out of your book, The Just Church, and that is that the issues of justice tie very, very directly to what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And rather than kind of separating those two, if we as the church can draw those together biblically, it seems that there's a lot there for us to dig into as we are seeking to lead people on their discipleship journey, as we are seeking to grow in Christ as well. So can you talk to us a little bit about how justice really in a local church setting, perhaps we can talk about that. How does that tie into, a discipleship journey with Jesus? Yeah,
this is actually why I went through the work of writing the book. I had been in ministry for something like 18 years before coming to IJM, and then the last 10 of those were at a church plant in Silicon Valley here in the U.S. And my role at the church plant was essentially I was the mercy and justice pastor on this team of pastors at this rather sizable church plant. And then I came to IJM to build partnerships with churches, because the church that I had come from was very deeply partnered with IJM. And I was in a Christian bookstore one day, and I realized that as the issue of justice was becoming more and more popular and people were talking more about it, I realized, any day now I'm going to walk into some Christian bookstore and I'm going to see a book on the shelf that's going to have the words justice and church in the title. And my realization was, and I'm going to be disappointed actually, because it's not going to say what it needs to say. It's going to talk about justice as something that good Christians should do because people are suffering in the world. And that's certainly part of the truth. But the deeper truth is that we engage in justice because we're mirroring the truth about the God of justice that we serve, who shaped and formed us and is transforming us to be this church that is light in the darkness. So the first half of the book is all kinds of is coming at that question from all kinds of different angles. How are the issues of justice and our discipleship inextricably linked from one another? So, we're talking pretty deeply about Scripture in the first half of the book. We're going pretty deeply into places like Isaiah 58 and some of the other classic sort of biblical justice passages in the Old Testament. And then we're also talking about this issue of the challenge of what challenging mission does to shape us as disciples. And this, to me, as a pastor, is some of the more interesting or the really interesting stuff is that what challenging mission does for us is it makes us hungry and thirsty for the spiritual disciplines that we've been trying to discipline ourselves to engage in, right? So my experience has been that the people that are working hard in the ministry of justice are some of the most prayerful people that I know, because they deeply desire and need to connect with God about what is so wrong with the world and about what is challenging about what they've been called into.
I love that. I love how the idea of if we're going to be on a journey with Jesus, if we're going to be taking those next steps, which every single one of us has next steps on that journey, that idea of understanding biblical justice and engaging in biblical justice is right in line with walking in the footsteps of Jesus. And I think that's powerful. One of the things that you talk about is you talk about these justice learning communities. To get really practical, like I'm thinking about pastors right now as they're listening in. What do these justice learning communities, what do you mean by that? What does that look like? How does that kind of come about in a local setting?
Yeah, sure. So the first half of the book is all this sort of raw material on how do we actually become people who are sensitive to this idea of biblical justice within the Scriptures. And then in the second half of the book, it really comes from iJam's experience of 20 years of walking with churches to help them find traction in this issue, both locally and internationally. And it's broken down into what is a fairly simple process. We want to have sort of a 3-phase process. The first step is an encounter. We want to have an encounter with the God of justice in the Scriptures and in the world. We want to see the Scriptures for what the content that they really convey, and then we want to see the world clearly for what's really going on. So we want to have this encounter pretty deeply in our churches, and then we want to explore what the possibilities are for our own church, and how it is that we perhaps uniquely might be able to engage locally in our community, or in the ways that we are already missionally engaged further away. Are there ways that we can expand into some justice work there? And then we want to discern what the possibilities are and then actually take the step of engagement. So we lay out this process that goes encounter, explore, and then engage. And the justice learning community really is the core people in the church that are coming together to do the essential work that's going to be required for the church to go through this process. Now, that may be some of the people that are on staff at the church. It may be some key volunteers. Usually it's a mixture of both. I was just talking with a pastor in New York City last weekend, and he was saying he had read the book, and one of the specific pieces of material in there for this justice learning community is something we call the justice assessment tool. And it's a separate download for free from the book that it's a 60-page document that will help you do a thorough justice assessment on the community around your church. What's already going on there? How do you find that out? How do you partner with what's already happening? How do you meet with the political arm in your city, in your town, to figure out what their needs and desires are around some of these justice issues? And how does the church come in to serve and not to be the expert, and not sort of charge into the space that people have already been working in and have been sort of wondering why the church isn't there, and to all of a sudden appear in a way that's less than helpful. So it's full of tons of resources like that, intended exactly to do what you said, to practically help the church engage in the places that are going to be most helpful.
That's good. Jim, oftentimes I think in our churches we see it. There's some people that get really maybe excited about justice issues, and then there are others that do not.
Sure.
In your experience in working, not only in your role in a pastoral ministry, but now as you've been, working with churches all across the country with IJM and helping equip and mobilize them, what has been your experience? Do you see that more people get more engaged in justice issues, or is it, you go with the goers as a pastor, those who are involved, or is there development of this over time that you see happening in churches? Or I'm just trying to help pastors kind of think through as they reflect on their context, what this might look like and develop into.
Yeah, sure. So we have some specific things and suggestions that we can make along the way as well. But to answer that very good question, I would say, my goodness, yeah, there are going to be early adopters that are going to rise as soon as you start doing this sort of encounter process, and maybe you preach a sermon about justice from the pulpit that actually engages some local and international issues. People are very naturally going to surface, and those are great people to begin with. But what happens is this wonderful blossoming as the justice sort of team forms in the church. You're going to find what you need actually is a whole bunch of skills, and many of them will be people that didn't realize that they were interested in the issue. They might not be the first people to come forward. But you're going to need people that are just well organized and know how to run projects within the church, and they can help sort of set the team up and put them on a good set of tracks that are going to help them get through the material they need to get through. You're going to need people that are good at being out in the community and interviewing practitioners that are already there and building bridges. And often those people are the sort of second wave to surface, and they're coming to the issue not necessarily because they're already passionate about biblical justice, but they're coming because they see a place where they can serve. Or they're coming because they might have been passionate about the issue, but they didn't see anything they could do. And the idea of engaging was overwhelming to them because they had no idea that anything meaningful could be done. So it was easier just to sort of leave the whole thing aside. But once we create an actual pathway with concrete steps that people can take, then more and more people surface. And sometimes it's quite surprising who it is that surfaces.
When it comes to people within the church, people are already engaged in the church on some level, like you said, kind of rising to the occasion as their hearts are kind of attuned and aligned with God in the midst of this as these things are happening within the church, as the encounter piece and then inviting people into the explore piece. Do you also find that churches who embrace biblical justice to a greater degree, do they also connect more readily with people who are not connected to a local church? I mean, is this not only an opportunity for discipleship, but also an opportunity to kind of build some bridges and make some connections with people in the community that wouldn't naturally maybe walk through the church's doors initially?
Yeah, the answer to that is absolutely. And I would say probably absolutely in three categories. One of them is going to be the people that just are disillusioned with the church, and either, never really never got involved in a church or had some involvement and just didn't find it satisfying because the church wasn't engaged in the issues that were most meaningful to them. And so the gateway or the bridge to a relationship with God never quite formed because they just never saw the church interested in the things that mattered most to them. And so to hear the church talking about local issues of justice, to hear the church talking about human trafficking and modern day slavery, especially for a younger generation, is a bridge that is very, very accessible. So that would be one category of people. The second category of people is, I would say all of our churches have people in them who haven't come forward to volunteer because they haven't heard a call that has made sense to them. So if you have police officers in your congregation, no matter how many times you announce that you need help in the nursery, they're not likely going to come forward
Right.
Their skill set is just different. This came home to me so profoundly in our own church in Silicon Valley here in the U.S. when I was up at one Sunday, I was preaching about our connection with IJM and some work that we were doing in Latin America. We were taking a team to Peru and dealing with unprosecuted sexual assault of children. And we needed some expertise. We needed a few different things. And I was telling the story of a recent trip and getting ready for the next trip. And after the service, this woman approached me that I had never seen before. And I knew most of the people in the church, at least on site. And so I asked her if she was new. And she said, no, I've been coming for several years now, but I haven't gotten very involved because I'm a trauma therapist and I have a huge caseload with the county of at-risk children is my caseload and my expertise. I do play therapy with traumatized children, all these different things. And I just haven't had the emotional bandwidth to get involved in the church. But I heard what you were talking about this morning, and I want to get involved in that. Mm-hmm. And this woman's name is May. It turns out she's Filipino-American. She speaks 3 dialects of Philippine languages. She's an experienced trauma therapist. She goes to Peru with us. She falls in love with IJM and the work that IJM is doing. IJM instantly starts trying to poach her. Successfully hires her onto what was then one of the main projects we were working on, which was a anti-sex trafficking project in Cebu in the Philippines. And she becomes part of a team that successfully reduces the victimization of minors in the second largest metropolitan area in the Philippines by 79%.
Wow.
She became the aftercare director. I didn't even know she existed.
Wow, yeah.
And so once we start talking about justice, she comes forward and she gets involved and it turns into this outlet for her that she never could have imagined for herself. And then IJM gets this great benefit. So she started working for IJM long before I did. But I would say, yeah, people do come out of the woodwork, both people that are becoming interested in church because of I would say because they're seeing the church reflect this beautiful aspect of the character of God. And then even people in the church that haven't yet come forward to sort of fully invest their time and their talent.
Yeah, that's a powerful story. Love that, Jim. Let's dig into something that's maybe a little more controversial, and that is that there are many instances where people who are outside the church are looking at maybe specific things that some church leaders have said or some churches have done perhaps that look the opposite of justice or compassion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do we help navigate that? Because that's becoming a very real issue in many of the conversations I'm having across the country here in the U.S., with people who are not connected to churches and they've even said this to me, that they feel that outside of the church that they are approaching justice issues more like Jesus than a lot of churches do. And
sure.
That's hard to hear, right? So, yeah. And I know there's great work going on. I know what IJM is doing, many other organizations and churches that are, working alongside of these organizations, and churches just in and of themselves within their own communities. So there are many great stories, and I don't want to kind of be dismissive of those, but there is a bit of this dialogue and this pushback against the church. And I think of, issues like immigration issues, for example. That's been a hot topic here in the U.S. for many years now, and where churches fall on that and the ideas of justice within that and those types. So help us as pastors and ministry leaders, how do we navigate some of those conversations? And, what do you recommend from your experiences in churches that you've been working with who've been effective in that?
Yeah, that's such a great and an important question. I think also, we could include in that in so many of our churches across a wide spectrum, the problem of sexual abuse within the church that is emerging as well, right?
Exactly.
So I would say I'm trying to remember this quote, and I apologize because I'm going to murder it, but it's an Edmund Burke quote to the effect of this: "Do not speak because your actions are so loud that I can't hear what you're saying." And I would say to the church that that's really the challenge, that we have entered into what some people call the culture wars by trying to yell loud enough over our actions. And it just makes this horrible cacophony, and nobody's hearing anything. So my plea to church leaders would be to say, find traction and take action. And that is what is going to speak louder than anything else. And it's challenging, right? We're not going to agree on the right approach to all of these issues, but let's find issues that have complete moral clarity, and then let's take action on those things. And let's love people the way Jesus called us to love people, with action, with word and with deed, and then see what people will say.
Amen. That's good. That's a good word. Jim, if you were to, which I imagine you and your team does, sit down with a pastor, a local congregation, and the pastor says, man, I really have a heart for biblical justice. I feel the Spirit of God moving just within me and my own time of prayer and reflection and those types of things. My church has not historically been engaged. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend? What are the first, maybe 1, 2, 3 steps? And I know you walk through some of this pretty clearly in the Just Church, but can you help the listeners kind of think through, what were some of the first things that a pastor who finds himself or herself in that situation might, where might they begin?
Yeah, another great question. So we created a program called Freedom Sunday precisely to answer that question. So 3 years ago, we invited several churches to take the first step on this journey by hosting a Sunday in September where they would talk about the biblical call to justice and talk about the issue of modern day slavery. It's hard and challenging to talk about, so we created a ton of resources, from sample sermons to AV resources to videos to things that they could use in the service. How to integrate worship into that, materials for children's ministry, everything that we could think of that we would want if we were in their position. And 3 years ago, we had several hundred churches that joined us and took that courageous step. Last year, we had 18,000 churches all over the world. Awesome. In 50 countries that took that step with us. So I would say that's an excellent beginning place. Those train tracks are already set up. The resources are there. They're renewed every year. And our team here at iJam will walk you through it. We'll actually help you along the way. And it's sort of a proven way to jump in. I would also say, the book, The Just Church, it's a good read. It's helpful, though I say it myself. We wrote it as one of the ways to talk about what it is to say it's the first 10 conversations that we'd want to have over coffee with any pastor. And so it's a helpful place to begin. It sort of helps you sort through that sort of fire in the belly urgency that you need to do something right now, and helps you just take that first step back, take a deep breath, and to consider what is a disciplined, meaningful action going to look like for us to take.
That's helpful, and I'll just jump in, Jim, and say a couple things. One, Freedom Sunday, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. I had the opportunity to talk with Gary about that and other people from your team last year. I was super excited to see how it just took off. Super exciting stuff. So I would really encourage those who are listening. We'll have in the show notes. We'll have links to Freedom Sunday, and so people can get more information on that. And that really is, as you said, it seems to be a great kind of launching point where pastors and churches can kind of begin the exploration or the encounter actually stage probably, and getting people just more aware and something very, very practical. But then also the book, The Just Church, that you've written. One of the things that I really appreciate about the book was not only did you provide a lot of solid foundational biblical, what I would say, something that would be very, very difficult for someone else to argue against. You've got some very solid things up front that I think is just hugely helpful to us as pastors. But then, as you mentioned, kind of just going through the practical pieces. I mean, you have questions, reflection questions to kind of dig in more deeply. You have, tables with different resources. You have, the links to, like you said, the assessment, all these different resources, very practical pieces. So I think a very powerful and helpful resource that if there's anyone who is listening and finds himself in this place, as you did at one point, Jim, as a pastor yourself,
right.
You basically wrote the resource, created the resource that you were looking for, which I absolutely love. So encourage people. We'll have links for the Just Church book as well in there. What would you say, you've got the ears of pastors and ministry leaders right now listening. What would you say, maybe something we haven't touched upon, but something that you'd like to leave with them in regard to this whole idea of living out and becoming and living as the Just Church?
Here's the thing. I think here's the surprise. We as pastors spend so much time working hard to prepare good, rich, healthy food for people. It's like the centerpiece of what we do. Every week we work hard to carefully prepare these delicious meals. And sometimes it can feel like people just aren't all that hungry, that they're just sort of picking away at things, right? In my role at IJM, the joy of being in the role that I've been in at IJM and being able to provide some sort of support for our teams in the field has been that it sort of feels like cooking for a swim team. Like people devour whatever it is that you can put in front of them, right?
Right.
And so I think the huge surprise about this this invitation into the work of biblical justice is that people engage, and when they're in with both feet, they get really hungry. And so they're coming back to places of prayer, they're coming back to places of study, they're coming back to meaningful places of worship and community because they have this deep desire and need to be fed and filled. And so I think that is just the huge surprise that so many people have found on this journey. And I think it actually shouldn't be all that surprising, right? Because the whole chapter 58 of Isaiah that we mentioned earlier, it's set up as this huge series of if-then statements, right? If you will, is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo yokes of oppression, to let the oppressed go free. And then what follows that is all of these if-then statements. If you will do that, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your gloom shall be like the noonday sun. You shall ride upon the heights of the earth. It's just this beautiful picture. You shall call for help, and the Lord will say, here I am. Right? It's all of the things that we most deeply desire in these places of intimacy with God. And what God is saying is, I want to give you those things. And really all I want, the way to get them is to engage in this call that I've issued, to engage in this call to biblical justice, to undo the yokes of oppression, to let the oppressed go free. And then I will be here. I will be available to you. So I think these are the surprises. I think people expect to have to kind of grit their teeth and get down to all this hard work, and they expect that it's going to be maybe controversial and difficult and all that. And I think what most people have found is that there are these places of real moral clarity that are not controversial, that you can step into pretty directly and pretty clearly. And that what happens for people is that they really come to life in a way that is really remarkable to see.
That's beautiful. Beautiful, Jim. Love that. Super encouraging. I'm sure that pastors listening in are encouraged and inspired. And again, we'll have links in the show notes to get more information. Jim, if someone wants to reach out to you, maybe connect with you in some way, how might they do that?
They can reach out to the connection inbox at IJM. You can tweet at me at JIMMARTIN. That's Jim Martin with an I in front of it. It's sort of a clever play on the IJM acronym. See what I did there?
Yeah, I see that. Well done.
Just put an I in front of Jim Martin, and that's my Twitter handle. And you can also reach out to me directly via email. So jmartin@ijm.org.
Excellent, brother. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on the Church Leaders Podcast. We certainly appreciate your insight, and we're praying for all the pastors and ministry leaders that are listening in as they are seeking how the Spirit is leading them and guiding them to really engage in these justice issues in their communities and in our world. So thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jason. Thanks so much.
I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on this week's episode. Every week, as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. So we hope you're finding value from the Church Leaders podcast. And if so, we'd certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcasts so they too can benefit from these interviews. Again, we thank you in advance. And if you have any comments, any questions, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com, or you can connect with me on Twitter. Finally, you can find this podcast as well as other great faith-based podcasts on the FaithPlay app. It's available for both Apple and Android, and so we encourage you to check that out as well. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.